tend to be talking about H.P. Lovecraft quite a bit on this channel, and for obvious reasons. He's kind of my bag, so to speak. He was the very first cosmic horror author that I ever read, and to this date, he is still one of my favorite horror authors in general. The man's writing was so incredibly influential that it's very difficult to find a horror writer who wasn't inspired by him in some way in this day and age. However, there are levels to Lovecraft's work. Not all of his stuff is fantastic, although a great deal of it might be considered excellent literature. For example, no one's really going out of their way to talk about the artistic merits of Lovecraft's Reanimator, even though it was still a very significant piece of literature and has, in its own way, inspired a lot of people. Nonetheless, there are some works, like, for example, At the Mountains of Madness or The Dunwich Horror, that are considered absolute classics of Lovecraft's writing. These stories are considered great even outside of the author's incredible reputation. However, there are stories that Lovecraft wrote that we could consider to be of even a higher caliber, to be real, true classics of horror literature. In my opinion, there is no Lovecraft story better than The Color Out of Space. It succeeds incredibly on two fronts. One, it is an incredibly powerful story of horror. There's actual terror and incredible suspense in this story. But two, it embodies Lovecraft's legacy on the horror genre more than any of his other stories. What do I mean by this? Well, when authors are writing cosmic horror, generally the idea is that we want to create a sense of hopelessness and a sense that human beings are incredibly small in the cosmic scale. We only survive as a species because the rest of the universe ignores us. Lovecraft wrote many stories where this was a central conceit of his narrative. However, many people have remarked that Lovecraft's monsters end up looking more or less like earthly beings. In The Color Out of Space, we see the most alien entity Lovecraft has ever written. And I think that it's a remarkable story in how Lovecraft is able to keep this entity alien as we, as the reader, try to figure out what its motives, if it has any, really are. It also includes that theme that I think exists in the greatest of cosmic horror stories. Think The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. Think The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. There's something in it about the fear of being changed into something else, of losing one's humanity. Nonetheless, I'd like to take you through a summary of the story if you haven't read it before. It is, after all, available for free online, and it's quite a short read. But after that summary, I'd like to give my thoughts, a little bit of analysis of why the story works. So let's get into it now. Let's start with a quote from the beginning of the story. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thick brooklets trinkle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentler slopes, there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss coated cottages brooding eternally over New England's secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingled sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. So opens the story, introducing us to the setting. We are in rural New England, in a place seemingly untouched by time, yet something is changed in this unchangeable landscape. The ancient estates of this rural backwater are abandoned. Into this scene comes our narrator. He remarks that immigrants have tried and failed to settle this abandoned land, but none have been able to stay. He has come to meet old Ami Pierce, the only remaining resident, who remains guardian over the secrets of the strange days which changed this place utterly. The narrator is here to survey land for a new reservoir. He has been warned about a cursed piece of land, the so called Blasted Heath, but he discounts it as the old wives' tales of a witch haunted city, Arkham. Once he arrives there, he finally understands the warnings of the locals. It was morning when I saw it, but shadows lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque. Our narrator discovers that the whole 5 acres of the blasted heath is completely desolate. Nothing has grown in the intervening years since the incident. But what happened in the strange days, as the locals call them? It turns out that in the 1880s, something awful happened, something that led to the destruction of a local family. Only Ami Pierce is there to provide the answers to our narrator. Ami is an old man with a drooping eye, yet not quite feeble, and possessing a keen intellect and surprising education. Ami tells our narrator of the strange days and the sad fate that befell his friends, the gardeners, in those awful times. By the end of his story, the narrator is coming to realize that the evil that happened here may truly be eternal, saying, "The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit this country by night, at least, not when sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham." Ami relates that it all started with a meteorite crashing onto the land of one Nahum Gardner. Ami and Nahum quickly sent to Arkham for researchers from Miskatonic University. The scientists test the rock and find it to be unlike any Earth material. It is soft, exactly like plastic, and a sample must be gouged out rather than chipped away. The sample of the rock they took quickly disappears, taking with it the silicon beaker that it was housed in. Researchers find it completely unresponsive to all their chemical tests. Furthermore, they find that upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum. There was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Water, acid, and aqua regia all prove to have no effect on it as well. The material is clearly a metal, but unaffected by all substances, both acid and basic. The researchers return to Nahum's ranch and gouge at the main rock again, and this time they find something shocking: a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color is impossible to describe, understood as a color only through rough analogy. It is glossy, both brittle and hollow. A professor strikes it with a hammer, only for it to pop and disappear completely, leaving not even a residue. The scientists are forced to recognize that it is a completely alien substance. The next night, there is a thunderstorm, and the magnetic rock seems to draw the lightning to itself, being struck 6 times within a single hour. By morning, nothing remains, or so it seems, much to the disappointment of the researchers from Arkham. When the time comes for harvest, Nahum Gardner is overjoyed to find that his crop is of incredible size and gloss, a yield the likes of which he has never seen. This excitement is soon lost, however, as he comes to realize that the crop's taste and texture is ruined. They are completely inedible. This is just the beginning of Nahum and the Gardener's family troubles. The Gardeners soon encounter unnatural examples of the native wildlife. Animals with limbs a bit too long, proportions which are wholly unnatural. Their horses are startled in the night. Strange footprints begin appearing around their land, and more strange vegetation grows on their property. The boughs of trees begin moving, even when there's no wind at all. A nice nod, perhaps, to Blackwood's The Willows. About a year after the meteorite's arrival, Mrs. Gardner screams about things in the air which she could not describe. In her ravings, there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. I absolutely love that Lovecraft says that she can only describe things using pronouns. It is it. It is they. There is no thing that she can describe. She doesn't know what these things are. It can only be described in the vaguest of terms. Mrs. Gardner can feel things fastening themselves to her and draining her of something. To Nahum and the others, it is obvious that she's gone mad, but we can guess that she is somehow more perceptive than the others of what is really going on. By September, all of the plants are decaying into gray powder, completely drained of their life, a chilling precursor of what is to come. The gardeners, perhaps unwisely, continue to drink from the well next to the meteorite's resting place, taking in more and more of the poison into their bodies. The son Thaddeus can see colors moving at the bottom of the well and is soon shut up in the attic across the hall from his insane mother. Hogs and cows begin withering away and dying, suffering from the same grayness and loss of limbs that affect the vegetation. When the harvest came, not an animal was surviving in the place, for the stock and poultry were dead and the dogs had run away. Thaddeus withers away and dies. Little son Merwin mysteriously disappears after a visit to the well. Ami Pierce continues to visit his friend Nahum until he visits the man one faithful day to see his old friend decaying away to nothing. Before his jaw disintegrates along with the rest of his body, Nahum informs his friend to the best of his knowledge. Ahem! It come from some place whar things ain't as they is here. Look out, Ami. It'll do something more. Sucks the life out. As men come to examine the farm and the bodies of the deceased family, a glow emanates from the pit next to the well. As Lovecraft describes it, this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight. It had a very queer color, and as all the men clustered round the window, Ami gave a violent start, for this strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that color before, and feared to think what it might mean. The light from the well begins to swell and grow in intensity, and Ami warns all the men to stay far away. A great shaft of phosphorescence leaves the well, while 1,000 tiny points of radiance stretch into the sky. At this point, as the column of unknown color flared suddenly stronger and began to weave itself into fantastic suggestions of shape, which each spectator later described differently, there came from poor Hero such a sound as no man before or since ever heard from a horse. When Ami looked out again, the hapless beast lay huddled inert on the moonlit ground between the splintered shafts of the buggy. The house in which the men are hiding is now filling up with the same light, and they must flee for their lives. The men flee just in time, for then, without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up toward the sky like a rocket or meteor, leaving behind no trail and disappearing through a round and curiously regular hole in the clouds before any man could gasp or cry out. Our narrator recounts that locals claim that the blight on the blasted heath still grows slowly each year, and people in Arkham tell stories of glowing trees. He hypothesizes that the thing that Ami saw all those years ago must have been a gas, but not one from our cosmos. It was just a color out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. I quoted liberally from the text in my previous summary, but I've left out a great deal as well. In my opinion, this is the most quotable Lovecraft story, and the one with the least amount of what we would call filler. Every passage of this tale is engaging. This is Lovecraft's strongest prose, I think, ever. Definitely the short story form helps this story to be readable. There's no padding, let's say. There's no trying to reach a word count here. There is so much in this story to love. The entire ending segment, from the discovery of the bodies to the eventual eruption of light that leads to the color seemingly leaving our planet, is really exhilarating to read. There's almost a perfect buildup of tension and dread throughout the story. Take, for example, immediately after the sample has disappeared, when we are given a description of Nahum's farm work in July and August. The narrator tells us that the labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt the age was beginning to tell on him. This sounds like a normal description of an old man who's aging and just can't do it anymore. A perfectly logical but somewhat out of place line at this point in the story. When we return to this part again later, however, it will be recontextualized. We'll notice that the line is a grim foreshadowing of what is to come. The disintegration of the family is not limited to the latter half of the book. It has already begun here. In the portrayal of degeneration, we move up gradually from plant life to animal and finally to human. Nahum's fruit have grown immense and glossy, but they soon find that for all the gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bites induced a lasting disgust. Despite recognizing that the meteorite was to blame, Mr. Gardner takes no measures to save himself or his family, but relies on his crops that are not in the affected area. From the gigantic but disgusting fruit, we move on to misshapen trees that faintly glow and move their branches. Then we move on to the bizarrely shaped wildlife, rabbits with too long a stride and hideously deformed gophers. Lovecraft is planting the seeds of a revelation. It doesn't stop with the plants and animals. This corruption must affect humans as well. The gray, blasted landscape that we are introduced to in the beginning reflects the fate of the entire Gardner clan, as poor Ami Pierce finds them all turned to gray mounds of ash. When we talk about any Lovecraft work, we have to talk about the theme of cosmic indifference. The Color Out of Space perfectly captures this overriding theme of Lovecraft's work. Cosmic horror, the idea that we are utterly powerless and insignificant in the cosmos. Our antagonist is, as we can best entertain, an entity. To call it a life form might be a bit too presumptuous. Our narrator calls it a gas and a color. Men of science refer to it as a color by analogy. This thing, as it is rightly called, comes the closest of Lovecraft's creations to embodying a force that we cannot truly comprehend. It actively defies understanding. It is immune to all scientific instruments and seems antithetical to all life itself. Lovecraft's most famous creation, Cthulhu, is an excellent symbol of cosmic horror, but is itself a monster of flesh and one that can be likened to existing animals. We can understand the shape of Cthulhu. He is basically a big green octopoid monster. The color, on the other hand, can only be understood by rough analogy to anything we understand. It is almost completely formless and incomprehensible to us. It does not have motives that we can understand, although it does seem to have some kind of intelligence. It seems to talk to the Gardner boys in strange tongues. It seems to lure them into the well which it dwells. The color might be some kind of vampire come to our Earth to feed on life force or matter in some way. Mrs. Gardner and Nahum both attest to it draining people of something. Perhaps it comes to our planet to feed, but it seems to depart very quickly. Well, after a couple years, although not entirely. There are terrible implications in the claims of the locals that the blasted heath is slowly growing, and Arkham residents claim that they see glowing trees at night. There's a possibility that the entity has also come to reproduce. The implication is that the color still exists on Earth in some way, even after it has departed back to the stars. It is referred to by some in this story as a visitor, a word which implies no malice. It doesn't seem like whatever it's doing is a targeted attack on the gardeners specifically, but just something that seems to be part of its nature. There is no knowing the thoughts of this being because although it spoke to the gardeners in some way, who knows if this was not, at least in part, their own minds personifying the being. It's never made clear whether this is a symptom of their mental deterioration or whether this creature in the well is really talking to them. And again, using the term creature isn't really accurate. This thing, this being, perhaps. As I mentioned before, metamorphosis and corruption are fears that appear very often in the horror genre writ large and also in cosmic horror. The horror of this story does not come purely or even primarily from the fear of death, although death does seem to occur. It is the fear of transformation into something less than human that concerns us here. Of course, you'll be familiar with some of Lovecraft's other work with this theme. We see the Gardner family degenerate both physically and mentally until nothing of them remains. There is even some reason to believe that death, sadly, is not the end for the gardeners. When Ami goes to check on the state of Nabby, who had been locked in a room after going mad, he comes across this scene. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. There is a sense here that the color unnaturally preserves the lifespan beyond what a normal human could bear, keeping them alive even as they crumble. Then one has to ask, with their bodies consumed by the color, is something else consumed as well? Could it be that the people live on in some way as part of this entity? Could this be what those thousands of shafts of light might represent? This question is thankfully unanswered. The madness that the gardeners suffer throughout the story is, in greater and lesser degrees, another type of transformation, made more terrifying that their madness often is simply an observation of the truth. When Natty Gardner screams at invisible creatures in the air and unseen things trying to attack her, we can tell from context that she's probably correct. We see Thaddeus has gone mad because he can see and hear the color in the well. Again, this is a fact by the end of the story that is confirmed to be true, at the very least, that Thaddeus heard something in the well and that there was something in the well. But it is also correct to say that Thaddeus lost his mind too. How else can we explain his seemingly compulsive need to self destruct by exposing himself to the well directly? His brother dies in a similar manner, presumably drawn to the presence of the well against their better judgment. Perhaps the complacency of Nahum and his family, merely accepting their eventual destruction, was another mental effect caused by the color. They came under its influence earlier than we thought. It's difficult for horror literature to be truly scary. There are no audio visual elements that a writer can use to provoke feelings of fear in the reader. Authors try various means to evoke a feeling of horror. Depicting intense violence and gore is one way of doing so, but this rarely works in print. Lovecraft succeeds in this story because the fear comes from the helplessness of the situation. We see the gardeners withering away at the hands of a force they do not understand. Human beings can't fight it because they can't even touch it, and their minds cannot grasp it. Even if one of them were to grasp it, their minds become incapable of the task through madness. The members of the family each come in their own way to understand the forces that they are dealing with, and this destroys them just as utterly as physical disintegration. Mental destruction is hand in hand with the physical in this story, drawing comparisons to the unraveling of the minds in Lovecraft's other stories, as well as the stories of Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen. In conclusion, this is perhaps Lovecraft's most well written story, well paced, well written. Lacking in the overly verbose language of other Lovecraft stories, this is the author at his best. The terror is immensely effective, with an antagonist that truly embodies the theme of cosmic horror. Our characters are sympathetic enough, and their gradual disintegration at the hands of extraterrestrial powers is a pleasure to read, if a perverse one.